to hear an update from the Middle East. Please note that we will be recording this program. Our speaker will present first and then take questions after, so feel free to write them in the chat for him to address when he's finished. A South African native growing up in La Jolla, California for over 30 years, Mark Silberstein studied at the University of California, San Diego and Tel Aviv University, graduating with a BA in economics and a minor in Middle Eastern studies. Mark's early career included positions with a prominent San Diego real estate finance and development company, as well as director of public relations at the Israeli consulate in Los Angeles, and subsequently, I can't read today, began a career in the toy industry. Mark, his wife Tali, and 3 children live in Israel, and he said they just flew back from visiting San Diego. So Mark, take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Melanie. Thanks, everyone. It's good to see everyone again. It's been a little while, actually, so the world has changed again. You know, every 2 weeks it seems to be a new world. So it's interesting to get into everything. So, you know, I think today I'd like to speak about sort of 3 things. You know, COVID situation in Israel, which you know is the number one. COVID situation in Israel, which is, you know, the number one. So do you mind changing it back to the previous view? Actually, I'm so sorry. On Zoom, so where I could see everyone. Hang on, maybe I can do that. Oh, I got it. Okay.
Yeah, you should be able to control your own view.
Yeah, I did it. I just did it. Sorry. I like to see everyone. Thanks. The COVID situation in Israel, and then the situation with, you know, Iran and the agreements, and then obviously, you know, the political situation in Israel, which, you know, are 3 serious serious things to talk about. So let's start with COVID, you know, which is, you know, I live here and we've been here throughout COVID. I think I've spoken to you guys once during it, but it's been really interesting to be here, you know, during COVID and to see, you know, how the country handles it, because quite honestly, you know, we're all stuck at home or stuck in our cities or countries. And my impression is we're cut off from everywhere else. So it's very hard to get an idea of truly what's happening, you know, in other places. You know, I speak to people in Europe, Germany. I spoke to Germany for a long time today, and it's like I'm speaking to 6 months ago. You know, they're totally locked down, and, you know, there's no vaccines in sight for them yet. And so it's been quite interesting to sort of ride this experience in Israel. And, you know, what I can say is the situation here is honestly amazing from a couple of different perspectives. You know, obviously, you know, Israel did a fantastic job, you know, rolling out the vaccine. And, you know, you have to, whatever your beliefs on Bibi are, or Netanyahu, you know, he really demonstrated a couple of things. One, he demonstrated Israel's agility, meaning just, you know, decision-making and agility has been in business and in government have been really, really key this last year. You know, if you're slow, you're going to be behind and there's going to be consequences. So he was aggressive in committing to vaccines and overpaying for them. You know, Israel overpaid for these vaccines. You know, I think the average price of the vaccine that Israel paid was about, I don't know, in the $40-something, you know, which was probably twice as much as it could have cost. You know, and it was very, very interesting when back in February, March, when the whole country was being vaccinated here, and there was just this huge push. Europe was still negotiating the price of vaccines, you know, and they were trying to get the price down on 500 million vaccines. And, you know, I'm not going to lie, it kind of like the thought went through my head, like, this is the difference between a Yiddish Corp and, like, you know, not a Yiddish Corp, because, you know, Bibi came out and said, like, listen, you know, however much we overpaid is, which I think it was like $1.5 billion shekels was the total amount that they paid, is a fraction of what it would cost to keep the economy closed for even one day, you know. So, you know, if we can open up one day earlier, then, you know, this pays for itself. And so, you know, it's 100% right. I mean, to see Europe trying to negotiate the price of vaccines down is, while the rest of the world is getting sort of a head start, it was crazy. So he certainly showed a savviness in placing these bets early, negotiating these contracts early. Israel has made the decision to jump into bed with Pfizer. They obviously, looking back on how things have played out, there's 4 or 5 vaccines in the world. It was the right decision. Israel could have jumped into bed with AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson or whatnot. The storyline behind Pfizer and the CEO of Pfizer, coming from Holocaust survivors and being Jewish is even more sort of serendipitous. And so, it turned out to be the right series of decisions at the right time. And, I think Israel is quite honestly, reaping the benefits of that now, because the country is fully open. The economy is growing rapidly. Unemployment, they just came out from a high of 25. It's now down to below 10%, and so forth. And so, I think he made all the right moves. The thing that was most impressive to me was, his demonstration of sort of his understanding of the psychology of the country. Obviously Jews and especially Israelis are highly suspicious people, and when you see around the world all this suspicion about vaccines and safety and efficacy and the rush to bring them to market, you had just a majority of the country, certainly enough of the country, literally rushing to get vaccinated, and that's not easy to do. I mean, we see in the States, we're now starting to see surpluses of vaccines and not enough people wanting to get them in some parts of the States, and so, that psychology and creating that scarcity or that urgency is not easy to do. You got to be tuned in, right? And so it kind of reminded me of, like, listen, no matter what you think of Bibi, demonstrates why he's so good at the politics of it. And so, the country was vaccinated rapidly. It went smoothly. I can tell you, it's an interesting story. I can't remember if I shared this last time, but it's an interesting story about how I got vaccinated when they were doing it. And this is another reason why, Israel is sloppy and messy in some of the things that it does, but on the other hand, they're very efficient and practical on some of the things that it does. It's just a practical society, because in a lot of ways, sometimes it's bad, but sometimes it's good, but there was a simple system of, just simply age groups, 75 to 70 get vaccinated, this week. As soon as a certain threshold hit there, they opened up 5 more years and 5 more years. And it really went quite quickly. But what happened is, due to the nature of the vaccine, you have to take it out of deep freeze. And once you take it out of deep freeze, you have to use it. So you can never, you don't want to take out too few based on the amount of appointments you have. So you always take out a little bit extra out of deep freeze. And so there was inevitably around the country, at the end of every day, there were surplus vaccines everywhere. And, it's such a technology-driven country. It's such a small, tight population in a small space. There was just text messages every day and word of mouth saying, hey, there's 4,400 shots in this city, there's 300 shots here. And people were like literally just sort of chasing these surpluses at the end of the day. And they just, they gave it out, because you don't want to let this go to waste. So there was no criteria for who can get the surplus. Anyone that showed up that was Israeli could get it, and again, that was effective. That created this urgency and scarcity, and I know when my parents went to go get it in the States, there was a story in San Diego that, like they were throwing away vaccines in New York and San Diego because they wanted to stick to the rules of only these people getting it. And they were very worried that it was going to be perception of people, jumping the line of whatnot. And so that's kind of an example of just the practicality of it. And, we were taking a hike one day, my wife and I, and we ran into some friends of my wife's parents, and they said, hey, did you hear that there's 1,000 extra doses it's actually an Arab village close to us. It's a Druze Arab village, so not a Muslim Arab village, a famous one, Daliat Carmel. And, maybe you should check it out. And my wife and I had already gone to 2 other previous vaccine centers before trying to get some surplus ones, and we weren't successful. There were just thousands of people there. So we said, you know what, we'll take a chance. We went down there. Lo and behold, we really drove into the middle of this Arab village in Israel. They had finished vaccinating the village, and there were 1,000 extra shots. Arab policemen, the Druze serve in the army. So there was Druze Arab soldiers that were managing the whole process in the main town, in the gymnasium in the middle of this Arab town. And there were probably 2,000 Israelis lined up, and it was extremely organized. And in the end, we were number 800 and something, and we managed to get our first shot. And, before I even got up from the chair after getting the shot, I got a text message from the Ministry of Health saying, you've just been vaccinated. You need to come back to this address at this time on this day to get your second shot. After that, a week after that, you'll be considered vaccinated and get an electronic certificate showing it on your phone. And that's exactly what happened. We went back to that Arab village 21 days later, exactly, got vaccinated, got another confirmation. And a week after that, got an electronic certificate, saying we've been vaccinated and so forth. And I think a couple of weeks after that, they launched an app on a phone that basically you could digitally verify, just walk into a shopping mall or a restaurant or an airline and show them through the app on your phone. It was really unbelievable. I can tell you that there was a lot of pride here. And I think that it was kind of a turning point in the perception of the country internally and certainly globally, because I have clients in Europe and in the US, and I speak to Asia a lot. And inevitably for the last 2 months, the first 10 minutes of every conversation is like, oh, I heard about Israel and the vaccines, and I heard about Israel, and you guys are ahead, and we're locked down, and you guys are there. It's unbelievable, sort of what this has done to the perception, of the country, and put little Israel on the map. Bibi played it right as well. In order to secure these vaccines, he didn't overpay. He didn't only overpay, but he agreed to share. Basically, as we're seeing now, real world data is invaluable in these vaccines, right? In creating, credibility and everything. And so Bibi agreed to basically be the test market for Pfizer and basically say, okay, we got 5.5 million adults to vaccinate. We will share data with you, reaction data, response data, efficacy data. And so you saw this, this was the only population in the world and the first population in the world to be mass inoculated with the COVID-19 vaccine. And so you saw this real-time data come out, flowing out about how the population was responding. And the bizarre thing was, it was a really surreal scene here because the vaccine was being rolled out widely, but COVID was still running rampant here. So it was a very weird situation where, you've been waiting for the vaccine after this awful year we've been through, but the country was fully locked down. We were in the middle of a full lockdown. And the hospitals were full and COVID was still running wild here. It was a terrible situation. So there was this weirdness, and the numbers were not decreasing for about a month after this vaccination drive. The numbers stayed persistently high, and there was starting to be some panic creeping into this. And then all of a sudden, the country couldn't take the lockdown anymore. It was, I think, the 3rd or 4th lockdown, and the lockdowns here are not like in the States. They're more strict. And the last lockdown, I think, lasted 12 days, and the country was just, people were violating it, and it was getting less and less, much harder to enforce. And they lifted the lockdown, and the numbers were still high, but then they started to come down, and they started to come down rapidly. And not only did they start to come down, but before they came down, it was so clear that the people that were getting sick were overwhelmingly unvaccinated people. You just saw the mix start to change. Overwhelmingly, the only people that were getting sick were unvaccinated people, and most of the people that were getting infected were kids because, you know, they were non-vaccinated. So, and I have to tell you, the country has slowly opened up almost completely, and it's completely bizarre to see the country open up and the numbers go down, because we've lived through this last year where we've gone from lockdown to lockdown. You lock down, the numbers come down, you open up, and slowly they go back up again, and then you lock down again. So it was completely bizarre. And, you know, as of last weekend, they lift the mask mandates for outside. You know, restaurants are open. They're about to open up to concerts up to 50,000 people. The COVID wards here are being closed down. I think there's about 160 people in serious condition, which is a key metric they track here, because that's the capacity issue at hospitals. At a high, it was like, I think 1,200, I think. So it's been phenomenal. It's been bizarre, almost surreal to see the effect of this. And you know, one thing that it's indisputable is, you know, the vaccine works. And you know, you can't hide data here. It's very hard to hide it. You've got so many, the government doesn't control all the data here. It comes to universities and hospitals and insurance companies. And so, you know, the data is just very, very clear. So I think a lot of people in Israel are proud, and they're happy to get back to work, and they're happy to get some normalcy. And, you know, obviously there's still a fair amount of concern about kids. You know, my daughter got COVID second day of school last September, you know, and so, you know, so there's a fair amount of, you know, concern about kids. But, you know, there was a big article this week saying that Israel's already procured the next 18 million doses through 2022 to start vaccinating kids, you know, in the summer, and then to prep everyone for their shots, for their next shots. So in a lot of ways, and I think this is not only on the vaccine front, but on the travel front, on the green passport front, Israel is kind of on the tip of the sphere in figuring out what post-COVID world looks like. Like, how are we going to travel? You know, COVID's not going to go away. You know, how are we going to travel? You know, how are we going to go to concerts again? How are we going to like treat vaccinated people versus unvaccinated people? You know, and so a lot of this stuff here is clumsy, because the government sort of steers from one decision and then reverses it to another decision, and some decisions they'll make, and then it's tough to implement, and so forth. So a lot of this stuff is clumsy and frustrating. But if you stand back and take a big picture, it's just like security challenges, you know, of suicide bombers or using, you know, fighting urban warfare. Israel's the first to do it, and then, you know, it trickles down to the rest of the world. It's the same with figuring out post-COVID, you know, life. I mean, Israel's trying to figure it out because it's kind of the first one to come out of it, you know. And so that's been fascinating. I can tell you, even I had to take a lightning trip back to San Diego in December to deal with a family medical issue. And even the difference between traveling from December to last week was astonishing. I mean, it was really astonishing. So, you know, I was able to take my youngest daughter that had COVID to the States, because she didn't have to quarantine when we got back to Israel, because she's got a green passport that expires on June 30th. And so it was, you know, you're starting to see some sense of normalcy in how things can function after a year of just complete, you know, dysfunction. So it's interesting what's happening here. It's very, very interesting, and it's a, you know, it is a proud moment for the country to be able to sort of play such a prominent role in like a global event. So before we sort of transition from COVID, does anyone oh, you want to do this way, Melanie? Can we open it, or can we open it up to questions, sort of as we end each section?
Whatever you prefer. Let's go ahead. So if you have a question about the COVID situation in Israel, go ahead and either raise your hand or type it into the chat. You had mentioned something about restaurants. If you had to show your vaccination, you could show it at restaurants and stuff. Are they requiring vaccination?
Yeah, so a couple of weeks ago when they first opened restaurants, they were quite strict about it. So when we would take our kids to restaurants, they say, no, you can't eat inside. So the rule is basically anyone can eat outside, but only vaccinated people can eat inside. You know, so I think that, you know, they did, like, they checked in the beginning, But I suspect, like a lot of things here, it's going to start to just get looser and looser and looser until it's a problem. God forbid there's not a problem. Philip has his hand up.
Thank you, Mark. We postponed a family trip to Israel from last December, and we're pointing to doing it in December. All the adults will be vaccinated. I don't think my 9.5-year-old granddaughter will be vaccinated. I'm hopeful that my 14.5 and 15.5 grandson and granddaughter will be vaccinated. What's your guess? Do you think the 9.5-year-old will be allowed in without quarantine?
Yeah, so I actually have some very relevant information that I had to deal with today, because my dad, whose brother lives in Israel and he's not Israeli and has been vaccinated, is really dying to come here. So let's start with just, what does it take for a vaccinated person to come to Israel today? I actually have a list right here because I called a friend of ours, the family friend that is landed in Israel 8 days ago. Same thing, vaccinated, non-Israeli son live here. And so basically what's required here is you got to go to the consulate. You have to have, you can only come to, sorry, let's start over. You can only come to Israel right now if you have a direct relative living here. So first degree relative. Or you can come for simchas or something like that, or funerals or Jewish life events or something like that. To get here, you have to have, like my dad's going to have to present my passport, his passport, an airline ticket. I'm just reading the list. An airline ticket, travel insurance that shows you're covered for COVID, obviously a vaccination card, the birth certificate of the person that lives here, which is crazy. And when you land, even though you're vaccinated, you're only out of quarantine when you get an antibody test showing that you have antibodies. So that's how it is right now. I actually have a real life anecdote of friends of my wife's parents. My wife's parents are Israeli and they live here. They lived here for 6 months during this whole thing. And they have good friends of theirs that are actually also Israeli, but got vaccinated in the States. And they came here a couple months ago as they started to open up the country. And what happened to them is, again, this is why I said it gets messy here. The rules just came out. The airport wasn't really sure about, it was chaos at the airport. The airport has been the weak spot of this whole thing for Israel, quite honestly, in terms of operationally. It's been a mess. The airport was a dysfunctional, and they landed and they've been vaccinated. No one sort of gave him instructions. They didn't really go out of their way to sort of ask what the new rules were. So they went to their apartment in Modi'in, and they're vaccinated. What did they do the next day? They got in the car and they came up to Zichron Yaakov, where we live, and to visit my wife's parents. They're sitting in the living room. The phone rings. It's the police checking on their quarantine. And the police says, "Where are you?" And they said, "Well, we're in Zichron Yaakov, which is like, hour and a half away." They said, "What are you doing there? You need to go home right now. Like, get in your car and go home right now, and someone's gonna call you." So they're in the car. They get another call from a police officer, and they said, a different one. And they said, "What are you doing? You need to be home." And they said, "Well, we didn't know the regulations, but we've been vaccinated. No one told us what to do at the airport. We try to ask. Who knows if they did, but we try to ask." And they said, "Okay, please hold on." A supervisor came on the line. They said, "You both have 5,000 shekel tickets. You are in quarantine for 10 days. After you're out of quarantine, you can contest the tickets." And that was that, And so it was, in the end, then they did land up taking the antibody test. And after 2 or 3 days of getting the results, they were able to get out of quarantine. I have no idea if they had to pay the ticket or not. I'm going to say, if I had to guess, I'm going to say that your kids are going to have to be quarantined through the end of the year, if I had to guess. I'm taking the whole family to San Diego in June for 5 weeks, and we are planning a 10-day quarantine for the kids, before a simcha that we have here. And that's at the end of July. So I think that, unfortunately, there's not going to be a way around, not having kids being vaccinated, because it's just such a weak spot, right? I mean, There's all these variants out there, and the variants are the Achilles heel of these things. So unfortunately, I think that's what's going to happen.
Could you send that information to Melanie so she could forward it? And
Sure,
then I would also, I guess, contacting the consulate here in the States would probably be who I should be getting information.
Well, what I've heard is, and this is from 10 days ago, which in these times is a lifetime ago. I've heard that, the government took the decision here, but the consulates weren't ready, and it's a total, excuse my French, shit show at the consulates. So what I've heard, and I'm happy to send the summary to Melanie, and what the lady told me today, whose daughter lives in Israel, is, you have to start at the consulate to gather all this information and download the forms and everything. But you can go to the population registry authority here, and they will be able to give you the final issue, the final permission to fly, once they validate that, I actually live in Israel. So I will send as much information as I just told you to Melanie, and I'm sure it's going to change as I dive into the freaking bureaucratic mess of getting my dad here. But it sounds like it is, going to get smoother and smoother, because there's a lot of people that are like all of you guys and my dad that are just, the first chance. My dad's just booking a ticket. He's going to come. And so there's going to be a huge demand here. And so they're going to have to accommodate this. It's a very sensitive thing, I think, that's arisen here, that Jews can't come to Israel. Yeshivas, simchas, kotel, it's very, very, it's a terrible feeling. I mean, I know like a lot of my my friends that are super attached to Israel, they've never felt like this before, that you just can't come, and so that's starting to creep up now. That's like the next challenge now that the vaccine's done and COVID is low here. I suspect that that's going to be a major issue, and a lot of people are just planning to come in the summer. I mean, my wife's family is going to have a bar mitzvah here this summer, and again, they're planning on coming, sending their kids that are teenagers 10 days earlier, to quarantine with some family here. But it's going to get messy, and they're going to have to deal with it soon. One thing to note, as a good example of how Israel's kind of the first one to figure this out, this whole issue of a vaccine passport, which is taken on sort of a civil liberties angle to it, because you don't want to discriminate against people that haven't been vaccinated, which is kind of forcing them to be vaccinated if they want to live, a normal life. There is that aspect to it. Obviously, Israel is not as liberal, where they just, they rolled this out, and if you want a green passport, you got to get vaccinated. If you want to go to a soccer game, here you got to get vaccinated. But there's politics around vaccinations. For example, like which vaccines do you recognize and which don't? Obviously, Johnson and Johnson, Pfizer, and and Moderna are going to be recognized. But do you let people in that have taken the Russian Sputnik vaccine? Do you recognize them as well? Do you let people in that have taken the Sinopharm Chinese vaccine? That is only 50% effective, according to the Chinese government. And if you say, no, these countries' vaccines are not acceptable, but these countries are, then you got a political consideration there. So that is what the government's trying to figure out what to do. Who do we what vaccinations do we let in and what don't we? And this is where you start to see the effects of sort of vaccine inequality, right? You've got some countries that are open and doing business, people ready to travel, ready to go. And there's some countries that are just, way far behind. I mean, and that they're going to be at a disadvantage, that they can't travel, for maybe a year after Israelis or the Americans could travel. It's amazing what happened in America since I was there in December and April. I mean, almost everyone in my family and social circle was vaccinated in San Diego. So it's amazing to see the progress that's been made in a couple of months. But you know, I don't know, the news in India from today was just crazy. The amount, you know, 315,000 people infected in a day. I mean, those are just crazy numbers. I mean, there must be tremendous suffering there. So this is vaccine inequality, and is going to start to be an issue now, you know. But one thing is for sure, I mean, I think it's basically been, you know, sort of acknowledged. Even Dr. Fauci was given an award, you know, by Tel Aviv University, you know, a prestigious award and so forth, and several other people. I mean, Israel is being widely referred to as like a blueprint out of this, you know, and so, and again, there's some things that have been messed up and clumsy, and some things that have been right on, you know. So, but I can't imagine that they're just going to let kids in here and let them just circulate and, you know, be everywhere without, you know, understanding what they're bringing with them. Any other COVID questions before we move on? Go for it. Ryan. Oh, wait a second. You're on mute. Ryan, you're on mute. Hang on. Maybe I can do it for you.
I just did it.
Oh, there we go.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I got you.
All right. I just want to reiterate, excuse me, what you said. I have a friend whose grandson is going to have a bar mitzvah in September. And according to what you just said, I would love to go, but she's not a relative. So
Right.
I will not be able to go. Is that correct?
No, I don't think that's true, actually. I do believe if you're part of a simcha, if it's part of a live event, I do believe you'll be able to come under these crazy regulations. That's
Do
my
Do I have to go to the consulate and get?
Yeah, you got to go through this whole procedure that I just spoke about with my dad.
And then when I get there, she lives in Netanya. So if she would pick me up, could I stay? Where would I go for 10 days? The police are going to know where I am?
You've been vaccinated. Have you been vaccinated?
Yeah, I have
Okay,
been.
so you would go right from the airport, ideally on day one, to go get an antibody test at a million places here. And then once those results come back that you have antibodies, then you're out of quarantine. You're done.
So I don't have to be in quarantine. Are those areas to get tested for antibodies all over the place, or do you have to make?
Oh, that's a great question. It's super easy to get tested for COVID here. It's super easy, but antibody tests are kind of a newer thing here. So you would have to make an appointment I've been told today that I got the antibody test at a private hospital, Asuda, which is like a world-class hospital. And it took about 2 days to get the results back. But I've been told that if you go to Tel Hashomer, which is the huge hospital in Tel Aviv, you get the results in 12 hours.
12 hours. All right. So I could, when they pick me up, I can go to their home and stay there, right?
Exactly. You just got to give them an address, you know.
Okay.
Technically, I'm just going to say technically, if you stay with someone else, because they will ask you in this questionnaire you fill out, you are supposed to quarantine in a room in the house. So they will ask you, do you have access to a bathroom? When I came back from, and this is a crazy story that I'm not going to tell, but when I came back from the US in December, I was not vaccinated, I quarantined in my own house. I literally was locked in our master bedroom for 10 days, until that second test report came. I didn't want to take chances, quite honestly, with the rest of the family. So I was happy to do it. But, I did it the right way, where I was almost went crazy, but 10 days in our, in our master bedroom, which had access to a little patio and a bathroom.
Mm-hmm. All right. So get there early.
Yeah, well, no, you don't, because if you've got the antibodies, which you do, you'll be out in a day. It will be a day.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
And things could change, just as Mark said. So the information he's telling you today could change tomorrow. So make sure you're checking with the Israeli consulate. Yeah,
like every day. Like one of the biggest pain in the asses of these new regulations, what you have to present an apostle. Am I saying that right? Which is a word like I've never even heard of until now, which I guess is like a very strict recognition of documents between countries, and I guess it's very hard to get. So everyone complained, this is crazy that you require this. So they dropped it yesterday. You don't have to, you don't. So things change all the time, all the time.
Okay.
Let's start with the consulate, and good luck with that, because I'm sure they're overwhelmed.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions on COVID related? I can't see everyone on the screen. Okay, so we'll move on to Iran, and the situation with Iran, which is, honestly concerning. So I think when we talk about Iran, we need to talk about some context here and some history. Obviously, there are, three issues which are very concerning with Iran. One is the obvious one, that they are determined and seem to be very advanced towards developing the technology to have a nuclear weapon. That is a very dangerous situation when non-democratic, authoritarian regimes control such weapons, and especially in this part of the world where there's a history of volatility. So that's destabilizing not only for Israel, but for other countries in the region, that are enemies of Iran. That's number one. Number two, Iran is built up this massive arsenal of advanced, missiles that threaten Europe and basically threaten the entire Middle East. They can really strike anywhere in the Middle East with these massive missiles. And the reason why that's even more dangerous is if you have the ability to shoot a high altitude missile, you can put a nuclear warhead on it, which basically means, you have you need two things to deliver this, a nuclear weapon and a missile, so that's what makes the missile program even more dangerous. And the third thing is that Iran is extraordinarily destabilizing throughout the region. They destabilize, Yemen. They back a lot of the violence there. They obviously are very rooted in South Lebanon with Hezbollah, who's a direct ally of them and almost a part of the Iranian army at this point. They are firmly trying to and somewhat successfully entrenching themselves into Syria. They've attacked, Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, and the airport. And obviously they are firmly a huge role in influencing what happens in Iraq. So Iran is, you add that all up, they're a massive destabilizing force in the region. Destabilizing force in the region. So I think that the President Obama, his efforts to diffuse the situation met with fierce resistance from Israel for a couple of reasons. Two main ones. One, it only addressed one of those three, meaning he was trying to address the nuclear issue, which in President Obama's eyes is the most pressing issue. Just stop them from getting a nuclear weapon. And really the agreement didn't do that. The agreement just paused them. It didn't remove any of their capabilities. It just made them commit to stopping their efforts or their march towards it for a certain amount of time, which, I think the Bibi at the time, and I think most politicians in Israel thought this is crazy, to ask them to stop for 10 years, and reward them with huge amounts of resources and lift sanctions and lift this isolation. What's going to happen after the 10 or 12 years? That's not a long time in the life of the regime, and they're just going to use this time to consolidate their power and influence and potentially come out of this agreement more powerful. And that turned out to be true, because any hope that this agreement was going to be the start of Iran's sort of transformation and integration into the region was false. It really just emboldened the regime since the agreement, and it's emboldened and entrenched them even further in all those theaters and areas throughout the Middle East. So the agreement didn't work from that standpoint. It didn't work at all. And it's certainly the money that it paid, the regime, or that allowed the regime to go out there and get, only strengthened a bad regime, right? So it didn't weaken them. The net result was it strengthened them. It might have stopped them from enriching uranium and so forth, but it didn't weaken the regime. It only landed up emboldening them. And obviously they still had this thriving missile program that is just waiting for a nuclear weapon. But the main reason why Bibi was, and the Israeli leadership was so vehemently opposed to it, was that the agreement was struck behind Israel's back and in secret. Quite honestly, Israel, the U.S. Back-channeled the talks, kept them very quiet, and initiated the talks without bringing Israel into the fold. And this was seen as a major betrayal of Israel's security. To obviously Israel is threatened way more, by Iran than the U.S. And so to not include Israel in the strategy from the beginning, whether Israel would have gone along with it or not, was I think seen as a betrayal. Okay, and also, quite honestly, I think that we all need to acknowledge that Bibi was not constructive when he came to the States and made this a partisan issue. By saying, listen, by basically so outwardly criticizing the deal of a Democratic president, but also I think Bibi also felt betrayed by Democrats and to a large extent a lot of the Jews that are Democratic supporters. That they chose to support this agreement. Basically putting politics first and not understanding Israel's concerns about it. And so it caused this huge rupture, as we all know, culminating in Bibi being invited to, a joint session of Congress and really just throwing just a lot of gasoline on this fire. And I think that you're still feeling the effects of just that rupture today. So, you can fast forward to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump pulled out of the Iran agreement and implemented really crippling effective sanctions. I mean, really, in fact, the country is weakened because of them and vulnerable because of them. And he did, again, I mean, I know politics is a sensitive thing. I'm not a Trump supporter. I never voted for him. I never will. But I'm also not one of these people that says, you can't say that everything he did was evil. I mean, he did create a lot of leverage against Iran by pulling out of the agreement and isolating them again after the agreement, after pulling out and implementing these sanctions, which is not easy to do. Now, he didn't do anything with this leverage. He left office and lost the election. So it didn't lead to anything, which sets up the stage for Joe Biden, to come in and figure out what to do with the agreement. And so basically, it appears that Joe Biden is really the feeling here against among the certainly this current government, which if you can call it a government, is that the U.S. is really telegraphing desperation that they really want a deal, and they've given up they've given up any leverage that they have over Iran. Iran only agreed to come back. They want these sanctions lifted in order to talk and so forth. And the talks seem to be progressing very quickly. And it's becoming clear. A couple of things are becoming clear. One, Israel's sort of not involved. They've been consulted, but there's obviously a clear disagreement. Israel is just vehemently, opposed to this agreement and the framework. Two, it's not going to address the missile situation or Iran's wider activities in the region. And three, there's pressure. Everyone feels pressure because there is an Iranian presidential election coming up soon, in a couple of months. And, once, politics is volatile this day, who knows what's going to happen? A hardliner gets elected, this and that. There's a lot of division inside Iran as well. And, this might be the only chance to get a deal done. So the two sides seem to be racing towards a deal. And in Israel's eyes, they're thinking that, the U.S. reeks of wanting a deal really at any cost, or maybe at an extreme cost. And, I think Bibi came out and said the other day, or was reported that he said that, Iran is just a master of playing a weak hand strongly, which, they are doing, And so it's a very tricky situation for Israel. I think what you saw, I don't know if we all saw it, but there was some sort of espionage attack on the Natanz nuclear reactor, and that was basically openly attributed to Israel. And, I think Israel's initial working assumption is, we can derail these talks through these things. We can just, we have a way to sort of slow this down or make ourselves heard. The problem with that is, it's going to cause a rupture with the United States. The US wants this agreement. They think it's in their best interest. Israel doesn't. This is a divergence of interest between the two countries, on a core matter. And so, I think Bibi realizes it's reckless to basically sabotage these talks through covert, actions, brazen actions. And so there is an inflection point here where, Israel doesn't have a lot of options on how to influence these talks, and it's concerning. There's a real concern. There's a lot of tension between Iran and Israel right now. There was even an incident last night here in Israel where, Israel bombed a Syrian, when they say Syrian, it's really Iranian, but Syrian site on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. There was an exchange of fire, a large barrage of surface to air missiles was shot at Israel's planes. One of them strayed into the Negev, and landed about 20 or 30 kilometers from the Dimona nuclear reactor. And it was a massive explosion. And there's pictures on the news today about debris from this missile, sort of rained down on the public pool in one of these kibbutzes. So it's a volatile situation. It's a very, very volatile situation with a lot of pressure that's building. But I think that, Israel's calculation is that Iran wants this deal. They're not going to escalate and sabotage the talks, and they can push. Maybe that's the calculation. So it seems that President Biden does really want to basically re-enter this agreement with some adjustments, but basically it's the same agreement, in Israel's eyes, and it's lead to the same effect. And it's risky in Israel's eyes. It's very risky. And I have to say that with 70% of the Jewish community in the US support, Democratic leaning, basically, it's going to be a little bit of an inflection point as well, because the US is so politics is so hypersensitive right now and so polarized, where basically you're just us or them, you're with us or you're not. There seems to be no sort of in the middle in the States right now. It's going to put, Jews in the States in a tough situation where, you're going to have to choose between, and I don't know if this is actually a real choice. The ex-Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, who I'm not a fan of, but, said yesterday in a talk, it said, Jewish leadership in America is going to have to choose between supporting Israel, supporting this agreement. It's going to be hard to do both. And so it's going to be this is going to be a flashpoint in the Jewish community and the Jewish community's relationship with Israel, which is also, with BDS and the anti-Semitism on the left, which is not easy to identify sometimes, which is already changing the relationship with Israel. I was appalled at the J Street, which is supposedly this pro-Israel lobby, which is the farthest thing from pro-Israel, in Washington yesterday, when Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren got up and said, we should restrict aid to Israel based on conditions of, Palestinian rights, and it's Israel's responsibility to vaccinate Palestinians and everything like that. It's appalling to me. I find it offensive, and I find it disgusting, quite honestly. So, this is going to be an inflection point, for the Jewish community in the States, I think. And so it will be interesting to see how it plays out. I think that's a good segue. Actually, let's talk about Palestinians and vaccination. First of all, do we have any questions on Iran before I go on to that? Okay. Regarding Palestine, I just want to say something about Palestinians and the vaccination. It really drives me crazy because, as someone living in Israel, I mean, I see so much coexistence every day. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, it's just crazy. My son plays on a soccer team in one of the oldest, Zichron Yaakov, one of the oldest Jewish towns in the country, and one of the kids on his team is from the Arab town next to us, and he plays on his soccer team, and it's fine. And they play yesterday. They played a proper league match against an Arab team that's the second best in the country from a huge Arab village close to us, and we go to Arab villages to play them league games all the time. So from where we stand, I mean, this country is incredibly integrated. And there's more coexistence here between Jews and Arabs in an hour in Israel than there is anywhere else in the world, quite honestly. To say that we're in a I don't even want to say it, but like an apartheid state, and we treat Palestinians terribly because it's got something to do with some religious conflict or some racist component is ridiculous. The Palestinians have always been a part of the agreements and part of the clear understanding they're responsible for their health care. They've always have been. And Israel's always helped, right? I mean, always helped at taking in surgeries, cases, care, just like Israel took care of, thousands of Syrians on the border up north with the civil war there. Medical help is not something that Israel is kind of sacrosanct. It is like, if you go to the hospitals here, you will see Jews and Arab doctors, nurses, everything working together. It's like a little sanctuary here of coexistence. So, the Palestinians have always insisted, and that's what they wanted, to take care of their own health care. Israel is not. Israel's responsible for providing the Palestinians a lot of other things, water, tax, tax rebates, all that stuff. But healthcare has never been one of them. And it got to the point where the hypocrisy of the Palestinians got so bad is they, when Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem, the Palestinians basically cut off all cooperation with Israel, including any medical cooperation, until Saeb Erekat, got COVID, and he's the one of the senior members in the Palestinian leadership. And then all of a sudden, it was okay for him to come to Israel because he was a senior leader, and he landed up dying actually from COVID. So this fact that the Palestinians somehow we are obligated, or it's our responsibility, or we're racist because we don't do it, when the Palestinians themselves cut off this lifeline to Israel, or this cooperation to Israel, is just absurd. I really was struck. There's a Palestinian election supposedly coming up, even though it's probably going to be canceled. One of the main guys that is running against Abu Mazen is his bitter rival, a guy named Mohammed Dakhlan, who's actually been banished from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. But he gave an interview. He said, "We have turned into a nation of beggars. This current leadership has turned the Palestinians into a nation of beggars, where we have to beg for our lives from the international community and everything." And he's right, and I think that it's heartbreaking to see the Palestinians just always have to go to the international community and plead and for them to take responsibility or to pressure Israel to do anything. It doesn't solve anything. Israel could give the Palestinians the vaccines tomorrow, which they have given them some, and it wouldn't solve anything. It wouldn't solve anything. So it's infuriating to a lot of people here to see, on the one hand, the Palestinians want to be treated as a country and they want to have their own state and their own government, and really they're blaming Israel for not having that. But on the other hand, it's pretty nice to be the victim, when it comes at Israel's cost. So the hypocrisy is getting clearer and clearer with the Palestinians. And I think the vaccine issue was it. I mean, they love getting up and saying it's apartheid state. See, we haven't got our vaccines. It's crazy. It's crazy. So I get, I get real sensitive about that, real sensitive. I will tell you just one quick anecdote. My son had, I told you there's one Muslim kid on my son's soccer team, by the way, who played the game yesterday fasting because it's Ramadan. So the rest of the team had to, really support him, and it was beautiful to see. And we had a big match against a very good Arab team. So we all drove up to the village, actually a beautiful village overlooking the north of Israel, great field. But the stands were basic. They were like small stands that were, probably 20 rows high. And they were just enclosed in metal. It was like a jail, just enclosed in metal fencing, top, bottom, sides, everything. And down the middle of the stands, there's a huge metal fence dividing the away team and the home team. And so, this particular Arab village is really into football. So there was probably 20, 30 all men on the home side team that came out, no women. And so in order to get to the visitors team, you have to walk through the home side team. So, I'm there, I walk through. First of all, everyone turns and looks at me. I'm 6'5", blonde hair, clearly don't speak any, Arabic, and my Hebrew's like, not that great either. But, everyone's really nice. Spoke to some Arab kids. One Arab kid came up to me speaking pretty good English, say, hey, what's going on? Where are you from? Told him, made Aliyah from California. I said, hey, where'd you learn English? He said, what do you mean? I learned it in school. So I said, oh, sorry, of course, sorry. I said, well, how's your Hebrew? He's like, it's kind of the same as my, my English. So I was like, oh, cool. So, I mean, they were playing around like kids. And so we get there and two interesting things happen. One, my wife comes walking in, with blondish hair, and my two blonde haired daughters come walking right through the home team, which was interesting. And then this one Muslim kid that is on our team, his mom and grandmother comes, and they're dressed in full, Muslim traditional headscarves and everything, walk through, the Arab side and come and sit on our side. He's part of our team, the kids on our team. And, we're all having a great time, and we're so happy that they're there. And a lot of the dads are shouting and yelling for the team and everything like that. And her son right in front of us came and went for a ball right in front of us and got kicked really hard, like in the chest, and started crying on the field. He was fine. He just got the wind knocked out of him. But the parents and the grandmother started crying. The women went crazy. The mother and the grandmother started crying. And all of a sudden, like 3 or 4 of the Israeli dads and the coach came over just to console these 2 Arab parents that were on the quote unquote Jewish side, and it was just the most, amazing thing to see. It was just like you turn to yourself and be like, what a freaking country. It's just bizarre and amazing at the same time, And, they came and they sat and had a great game, and, we lost it. They crushed us. But I thought it was a very symbolic sort of thing, and it happens every day. It wasn't unusual to anyone. It was unusual to us, because we've been here the least amount of time. So anyway, that's my little anecdote here. The last thing I do want to talk about is the elections. But before we move on to that, any other questions up until now? Great. So let's talk about the election. And I'm not even sure what I could say about this. It's such a disaster, the political situation here. Basically, we just had our 4th election in 2 years. I'm getting really good at voting here, like really good. I mean, the kids came with me the first 2 times because they thought it was so cool. And now they're like, we're not coming anymore. But it's, it's always organized and whatever. And basically the issue is, if we can say it just very clearly, is, Netanyahu he's the longest serving prime minister Israel's ever had. He will go down in history, positively and maybe less than positively. He's under indictment. So, I think like a lot of these guys, I consider Bibi like a more sophisticated, more savvy Trump. He's very, very shrewd. He's very political. He knows, they always say about Trump, he's a great tactician, but a terrible strategist, and so I think Bibi's a great tactician and a great strategist, and so he's a political genius. We all have to admit it. And you don't get to stay in government in Israel for that long without having some real talent. But the problem is, after forming so many governments and so many governments breaking up and burning so many bridges, he's just burned too many bridges. There are just too many people that have come to the conclusion in government that they will not sit in the government with Bibi Netanyahu because they don't trust his commitments. They don't trust anything. I mean, just for example, this last this unity government that got together, there was supposed to be a rotational government with Benny Gantz that was supposed to be prime minister after Bibi, and there's just no way Bibi was going to let him be prime minister, and that's why we're in this election now again. And with each election, Bibi's hoping that the math will change and that he'll be able to form a government, meaning he'll be able to get the support of 61 or more out of the 120 members of the Knesset. And basically what's happened is there have been 4 elections and it's basically been roughly the same result. And Bibi does not have enough, well, actually it's gotten a little worse for Bibi every time. Bibi does not have enough people that want to align with him to form a government. He simply doesn't. And, another thing, back to, this is just the craziest thing here, back to, this whole argument that Israel's an apartheid state. Bibi and all the people that are willing to support him got up to 59 seats. You need 61 to form a government. So the only person which would entertain sitting with Bibi, or not entertain, but what was open to it, was a freaking Arab party, was 4 seats Arab party. And all of a sudden, this guy in an Arab party held the keys to the Jewish state, to forming a government in the Jewish state. And it's unbelievable. I mean, there's no way you can say that this is, certainly not an undemocratic, or an apartheid state. This man who's, gave an amazing speech on Jewish-Arab unity the other day, he's obviously got some really troublesome, things in his political past and statements that he's made. Everyone will point to that. The people on the far right call him a terrorist and so forth. And it's gotten really ugly from that standpoint here. But bottom line is, Bibi Netanyahu called him last night to see if he would support him in the government and join his government so he can continue to be prime minister. That's unbelievable. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So the situation here now is Bibi's not, he certainly won the most votes. He's the biggest party, but he cannot form a government to get enough people to support him. And so what's going to happen now is, so either there's 3 things that are going to happen now, assuming that Bibi, he's got another, I think, 12 or 13 days to form a government. He's either going to, the president, President Rivlin, is going to give the opportunity to form a government to someone else and see if they can do it, which is not easy. Israel, I think we all have to admit, has shifted to the right, a little bit to the right of center versus left of center. So versus probably 10 years ago. But they either got to give the responsibility to form a government to someone else, or they have to go for another election, basically, is what there is. They have to basically say there's going to be a 5th election, which is crazy. Or what you can do is you can say, listen, I've only got the support of 58 seats, but I've got an agreement with this Arab party or this Jewish party, whoever it is, to support the government from the outside. Meaning, it's a minority government, but they have the support from the outside to make it a government. Those are all like bad options. Those are all, I mean, no, not all of them, but a couple of those are bad options. Obviously, a 5th election would be ridiculous. It would obviously be ridiculous. And many people say that Bibi's already positioned himself for a 5th election. And he's just waiting to and hoping that the numbers change and that, quite honestly, the success of coming out of COVID, will carry him, all the way and continue to be prime minister. He is fighting for his legal life. He's embroiled in an indictment trial that he says is nothing, that, some people say is something. Who knows if something will come out of it? I think if you're a suspicious Israeli, you would say nothing's going to come out of it, but he's scared of it for sure. And, obviously, when he's not prime minister anymore, he is more vulnerable and not protected legally. So, the charges brought against him are, could entail jail time, and so he's literally in a way sort of fighting for his life. So he gave a big speech last night, and, I think the feeling was he came off being really desperate and really kind of trapped. But, one thing I've learned is he's a master. He's a political genius. And, if anyone can get his way, I've thought he's been in a corner plenty of times before, and he manages to find a way out of it. But there do seem to be a lot of people here in the political parties that are just are starting to envision a day after Bibi, and I think it doesn't help, where that Trump actually left office, where, it was kind of hard to believe he was ever going to leave office until he did. No one believed it until they saw it. And so I think that there are, there are people here, even in his own party in the Likud, that are starting to think, about the day after Bibi. So we'll see how long. Bibi is his main political backbone. His main political allies are the ultra-Orthodox parties. They, up until now, through 4 elections, have not abandoned him, meaning they have refused to even entertain forming a government with anyone other than Bibi Netanyahu. So that takes a lot of seats out of the equation. I don't know how many seats exactly, but at least 20 between them. So we'll see how long, they sort of stay in Bibi's pocket. And, they always say, if there's another election, don't count on our automatic support, Bibi. But it's just, this is power that everyone's after, and everyone's afraid to lose it. And so it's a little bit disgusting, the political situation here, I have to say. It has gotten to a point where it's just disgusting. But I will say this, though, that my general feeling is that the divisions in the states right now run deeper than the divisions in Israel. There's a real feeling in my mind in the states of us versus them, Americans versus Americans. You're either with us or you're not. Either believe that we're destroying, the right believes the left's destroying the country, the left believes the right destroying the country. I mean, it's crazy. And I don't believe, maybe I'm naive, but I don't believe that the divisions go that deep here. They go deep, but I don't believe they go that deep. And hopefully I'm right, because God forbid, what happened on January 6th, if that's the American version of what happened on January 6th, the Israeli version is going to be a lot worse, but, thankfully we haven't got to that point yet. And I pray that we don't. And, I'm not sure that, this is the good thing about having all these individual parties versus 2 parties in the States. I'm not sure that, a lot of these other parties would accept that, would accept that at all, versus in the States where you had, a large part of the Republican Party that still has accepted that happened and is fine with it and seems to be moving on, So I'd like to think that there are more sort of governors, automatic governors here in the system before we get to that point. But I honestly could not tell you what the government will look like here. And I, know a lot about this stuff. I read about it every day in the next month or 2. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you if there's going to be another election. There's a very good possibility that the head of a 7-person party, Naftali Bennett, is going to be prime minister, which is crazy because he is basically the swing vote that the anti-Bibi bloc needs to form a government, and he's the swing vote that Bibi needs to form a government, and he's got very, very high ambitions. So the anti-Bibi bloc might need to say, hey, you be prime minister in exchange for coming and supporting us to get Bibi out of office. And that's a very real possibility that Naftali Bennett, who's American, by the way, made Aliyah from America, speaks perfect English, could be prime minister. But he's very, very right-wing. He's extremely right-wing. He positions himself to the right as Bibi. But, it's easy to be right-wing when you're in opposition and you're not prime minister. It's harder to be that right-wing once you're sitting in the seat and you got to deal with the world head on. So it's it's going to be interesting to see how things play out. Very, very interesting. And there must be a question about the political situation here. There's no way I explained it perfectly clear.
Feel free to raise your hands, or you can type it in chat.
Ryan, you're on a roll today. You're on mute still. Yeah.
Hold on. I'm learning a lot. That's why. Who is this group of ultra-Orthodox people who always support Bibi? Where do they live? Are they in the Mea Shearim? Do they vote? Are they in the Geula area? Do they vote?
Yeah.
What compromises this big block of Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, excuse me, voters who are always supporting him?
Right. That's a great question. So, because we need to be careful how loosely we throw around these names. You know, there is not all Orthodox Jews are the same, as we know, and obviously because Israel's, you know, the biggest Jewish community in the world, or almost tied with the States. We have to be, you know, there's lots of different types of Orthodox Jews in Israel. There's obviously modern Orthodox Jews, which have a black velvet kippah. There are national religious Zionist Orthodox Jews, which, you know, generally live in, modern Orthodox Jews have the velvet kippah and don't go to the army. They study for a living or work and study, but they don't go to the army. Then you have religious Zionist Orthodox Jews that have the knitted kippah, that are live generally in the West Bank and you know, serve in the army, you know, as a sacred duty almost. And then you have the ultra Orthodox Haredim, which have, you know, the black hat, you know, black furry hatters, and those are the Jews that live in Mea Shearim, and that really they technically do not recognize the state of Israel.
Right.
So even their party heads, the heads of their political parties, when they join a government, the heads of the political parties are forbidden from serving as ministers in the government, which is crazy. So they always are given like a deputy minister job or whatever, but they are the de facto minister. So these are the Mea Shearim, the ultra-Orthodox, you know, yeshivas that take their voting instructions, life instructions from their rabbis, not from the government. They are a world in a world here. And what's important—
They vote?
They absolutely vote. They vote in huge numbers because their rabbi tells them to. They organize buses. They come out, I don't, you know, almost said religiously, but, you know, they come out with such discipline, and they always vote in high numbers. Their numbers are always the same. They basically win the same amount of seats every time. And what's important to them? There's really three things that are important to them. One, they don't want to go to the army. They want to study. There's a lot of resentment in Israel that, you know, they're growing in numbers, and a larger and larger part of this population is not going to the army and sacrificing. Now they'll say, listen, all the guys in the army, or a lot of the guys, are secular. They're not friggin' studying Torah. Who's going to carry on, you know, the Jewish tradition and the Jewish, the Torah to the next generations? So we're the ones, you know, that are also sacrificing, or not sacrificing, but taking responsibility for the other side of the Jewish state, which is upholding Judaism. So there's a lot of tension between that. But they do not want to go to the army. They think, you know, anything that takes them away from studying Torah is a sin, basically. I mean, maybe that's too strong of a word, but is not acceptable. Number two, a lot of them don't work. Not all of them. In fact, you know, I shouldn't say a lot, but a large percentage of them don't work and get money from the government, get subsidies from the government to study and to live. And the yeshivas get tremendous amount of funding from the government. So they want that money to keep flowing. And if they're not in the government, that money is going to start to be reduced. So Bibi has basically guaranteed, he said, listen, you know, I'm your ally. You will always get this money, basically, and you will continue doing what you want to do. And basically, so, I mean, I combined both into, the other one is, there are certain civil, you know, the Rabbanut, which is the Orthodox authority here, governs Jewish life in Israel. And there are certain hot button issues, which we all care about on this call, which are in direct contradiction to their views on it. mainly marriage and conversion. And so, you cannot have a civil wedding in Israel. If you want to get married in Israel, you have to have a rabbi from the Rabbanut marry you. And there's a lot of Russian immigrants here that don't want to be married, with the rabbi. There's a lot of regular Israelis that aren't Russian that don't want to be married. So they have to fly to Cyprus or the US to get married. The issues of whether gay people can get married here is also, so those key aspects of Jewish life, they want to protect and keep it within the realm of the Orthodox world. They are not open to it. Even things like having a woman be allowed to pray at a section of the Kotel, a separate section. Just women being allowed to read from the Torah in Jerusalem. It causes these are all huge hot button issues that seep into politics here. Those are the things that are very important to them. They're actually very easy to predict, and they actually make great government partners in a government, because you know what they want. These are the things that they want. You give it to them, they are loyal and they will follow you, whatever else you want to do. Iran, Palestinians, whatever it is, as long as those things are sorted out, they're great partners. And Bibi knows this, and this is why they are so loyal to him. He takes care of them. They are incredibly loyal to them, incredibly loyal to Bibi. And Bibi's loyal to them. Probably one of the few people, groups that he's been. But we're talking about Meir Shirin.
Okay, thank you.
B'nai Brak.
It's B'nai Brak.
Yeah. Any other questions? Wow, there's a lot of talking I've just done. I'm gonna have to drink 9 bottles of water here. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, those are the 3 things I really wanted to go over. The only way that I'll tell you is that I think the feeling here, sort of post-COVID, from an economic standpoint, is that, the high-tech economy got this country through this time. The pain here was so the pain everywhere is concentrated in, travel, entertainment, and restaurant and retail, right? Very concentrated economic pain all over the world. But, because the rest of the world basically is boomed throughout the last 12 months outside of those areas, and specifically technology companies like Zoom and everything that goes around it has just exploded. Israel is really, from a high-tech sector, has benefited. There are more companies that are going public and exiting in the last 12 months here than you could ever imagine. So I think the feeling in the world, not just by Israelis, but even European central banks, is that the economy here is very, very well positioned to come out of this, healthily. Obviously, as Melanie said, things change by the minute, and even since we've been talking, maybe things have collapsed. But so far over the last couple of weeks, when things have, last month really, when things have been wide open, it's been amazing to see. It's been really amazing to see. So I hope that, that continues.
Before we close, happy 73rd birthday, Israel. We just Yom Ha'atzmaut was last week, a few days ago, last week.
Well, it's interesting, when, and I promise it's the last anecdote, but when I met this group and when I was working as the director of PR for Israeli consulate, it was Israel's 50th birthday. That's why they hired me. And so I was sent out to give these lectures to everyone that wanted to hear. And when it was on Yom Ha'atzmaut, I got invited to the Orange County Jewish Federation, Yom Ha'atzmaut ceremony. And I actually landed, the mayor of Orange County introduced me, which was crazy. I was like a nothing kid. I was so young. And so he was pretty boring speaker, the mayor. So the crowd was just dead. They just really didn't want to hear anything. So I had to think of something to say just to get get everyone going. So I got up there and I just said, it's so great to see everyone, on Israel's 50th birthday. I said, the only thing that's going to be better than this is seeing you on Israel's 100th birthday, which back then is you couldn't even imagine that Israel would get to 100 years old. It was unbelievable. I could get to 50 years old. And so the crowd goes crazy, yeah, Israel 100. And now I'm thinking, wow, 70, we're at 73. That's not that far away. We can do this, we can maybe do this. So I always think of that line, every year.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. For more information about the latest in the Middle East and from another perspective, tune into the series with Professor Jacob Goldberg on Monday and Wednesday next week at 10 a.m. And we also have our monthly JCC Social Circles movie discussion coming up next Tuesday, April 27th. We'll talk about a foreign film from 2011 called A Separation. And Connect with Shabbat is next Friday, April 30th, where we'll gather on Zoom and learn about some of the Shabbat ritual objects and the holiday of Lag BaOmer. And the first 25 people who register will get a Shabbat tote complete with challah, grape juice, and candles. Our next Middle East update will be on Thursday, June 10th at 2 p.m. with Guy Sella, a former officer in the Israel Defense Forces who works at our JCC. We'll have more details about that in the future emails from our JCC Senior Department. And you can check out our website, lfjcc.org, for information and how to register for the Professor Goldberg series. And also we'll be sending a follow-up email to everybody who had registered for today's event so that you can get registered for that event for next week, the series. He comes annually and we look forward to hearing him as well. So thank you so much, Mark, and thank you all for tuning in. And I'm glad the Zoom didn't drop when my computer decided to shut down. I texted Sarah real quick. I said, uh-oh, she said, it's still going on. So.
I saw you drop off.
Technology, you never know what to
offended you or something. Anyway, guys, Lila Tov, I'm going to go to bed.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye, guys.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.